find their way in as we begin. Let's start with prayer. The Lord be with you. Let's pray. Almighty God, we thank you. We are in awe of the beauty of your creation. May it shine through to us no matter what. Fill our hearts with joy and peace. Give us the strength to forgive. Thank you for those gathered here today as we continue to delve into your word and your life in a complex world. In your holy name we pray. Amen. Howdy. Thanks for coming. This presentation I have is something that I worked on for my Ph.D. in philosophy. It was just really, they allowed me to do it in an unusual way, which is kind of a meditation on religion and philosophy and thinking about kind of some of the fundamental dynamics of what makes faith itself. I wanted to say unique, but that's kind of a weird word. I mean for this to be a simple thing. I hope to present it in a simple way and not in a way that feels really hard to follow. Of course, I guess everybody thinks that, but I'm going to try. This is the first of 3 presentations I hope to give, in the next year or so. The first one with faith and science, the second one with faith and art, and the third one with Christianity and interfaith dialogue. I think of them all as really interrelated and hopefully helpful. Hopefully helpful. Okay, so I am doing a class right now, a couple of you are in, called Christianity for Dummies, and we start that class off with this really seemingly simple, but I think interesting quote that you're probably familiar, some variation of, and it's, those who do not work will not eat. You guys familiar with, it's like, just a colloquial phrase. If you don't work, you don't eat. Kierkegaard does this long not analysis. Kierkegaard is like a philosopher, Danish philosopher that was like, I'm not going to go into my relationship with Kierkegaard. Someone that I really appreciated in my 20s, and then when I started reading again in my 30s, I thought this guy takes himself too seriously, maybe that's, okay, anyway. But Kierkegaard has a lot to say about this, and part of it is, he makes this distinction, and that is, he says of this phrase that he who doesn't work shall not eat, he says where you expect it to be true, it's false. Where you think it's false, it's actually true. So you'd expect it to be true, so he thinks, in the material world. In the material world, and it's just not true. And plainly not true. So, well, what I have in mind here is, I think what Kierkegaard has in mind is that, actually someone here might know, how much of the wealth of the world is inherited? It's like 40%. It's some ridiculous number. Emil, do you know? Something like that, 40%. It's a lot, maybe 60%. It's complex, let's just say that, but it's a lot. And the point is that at least one person in the world didn't do anything to get their wealth, they inherited it, right? And so this is Kierkegaard's basic idea. He who doesn't work shall not eat. It feels like it's about material substance, whether it's the house that you live in or the food on your plate or whatever. The stuff that you've got, you actually don't have to work for. In fact, lots of people don't work for it. That's just the definition of inheritance. Exactly. Metaphorical, right, yes. Literary. Yeah, you're tracking. What was that?
Your life is wasted if you don't work.
Okay, we're going to get to that. But I just want to start with this very simple idea that a lot of material wealth is passed on. It's inherited, it's given, you don't have to work for it. But here's the rub, and this is where it gets controversial in my mind. Kierkegaard actually thinks that it's true in the spiritual world. If you don't work, you don't eat spiritually. And in class, we just like go round and round, and it's fantastic. But the thing that we always come to is like, wait a second. And this is true, and every time I've done this, and it's wonderful because it kind of a light goes off, and you say, wait a second, are you telling me I have to work to get God's grace, God's love? And it seems fundamentally contradictory in that way. If you don't work, you don't eat. That seems like, no, that's like the one thing that's supposed to be true about church is that like God freely gives out love and grace. So like, do we have to earn our faith? Is how Luther would say it. Here's how I want to present it though. I hope that this is equally just transparently true. The goods of faith, the stuff that makes faith worthwhile, the important things of faith, those things can't be known second-handedly by a second degree. I got a simple example. The relationship between me and my children is not something that can be inherited or bought. It's something I have to work for. It'd be worth thinking about how you could inherit a good relationship. Like, for instance, if I knew like all the facts about my children, or if someone like came up with a list of all the facts and they're like, they were born on this date and they like these things, and if I learned that and memorized it, maybe I could inherit. You know what, I'm trying to like think of a way in which I think actually the way that we think that you can inherit a good relationship with someone is through money. I mean, thoughtlessly we think this, it never works out, but like, if I buy them more stuff, they'll like me and like have the good relationship. But what Kierkegaard is saying, that I actually think of the spiritual world as very close in better alignment with our term of relationship. I think of the word of relationship as a secularized version of what I mean by faith or the spiritual world. So, Kierkegaard says that without working, you can't eat in the world of relationships. If I am to know someone, I have to spend time with them, to be present, to like walk with them as they grow and develop. The other way to think about it is like my relationship with Jenna. Jenna and I got like married as like children, as babies, like we started dating as teenagers. We met in high school. We were both in high school visiting the college that we would both go to, and we were in the same tour group. Isn't that crazy? They took a picture of us, of the whole visiting group when we were in high school, and Jenna put it on the fridge, and her sister, who's older than she is, pointed to me and said, Jenna, can you imagine marrying that guy? It was me. And she did. The person that I married at 22 is not the person that I am married to now, right? This is not about marriage or necessarily about children. It's just about any significant relationship that you have. In order for that relationship to be significant, you have to put in the time. Both good and bad. The fights, the joys, the ups, the downs. you can't know someone through inheritance. You have to work for it, or work towards presence. It's the same with God. I can, as a priest, I can tell you a lot about what I think about God. Unless you take that in, we can learn a lot about God from the Bible, or from each other, or from creation, but unless you take that in, inwardly digest is the word that the prayer book uses, the relationship with God will be infantile, or trying to think of a good analogy. It will be a planted seed is the image in Mark. What do you think about that? It's a fundamental distinction. There are some things in the world that we can inherit that you don't have to work for. I don't have to do any work to figure out the distance between the earth and the moon. Somebody else does that. If I am to know what Jenna is, and not like red hair and likes to sing, and I have to like work for that. What do we think? Take a pause to, if you're not with me now, you're never going to be with me. All right. Can you guys in the back see this? Sorry, that was a joke. You birds again. I want to suggest, here we get into the science part. I want to say that a lot of science works a lot like the things that you can inherit. I think of science as wanting and needing its wheelhouse, its good place, is that which allows hard, fine distinctions. And so the word I use for spiritual, the analog, is relationships, faith and relationships. I think of them as being in the same ballgame. For the material world that Kierkegaard uses, I think of the material world being in the ballgame of facts. That facts are something that you can inherit. Again, like, I don't need to know how mRNA works in order to get the vaccine. Like, I can inherit the hard work of other people. Facts are rigid. They're binary. They're true and false. We don't always know. Thank you, Dana. We don't always know a given fact about something, but usually facts are knowable. For instance, how much weight can a bridge hold at any given time and under circumstances of like earthquake? Yes. He said lots of facts are hard to understand and requires work. Yes, thank God for the scientific community, for the people who figured out mRNA, people who figure out, I'm getting too close to the speakers, for people who work hard to build bridges. Love it. But what they're working for is a rigidity, a true falseness. We don't want to be like, it's guesswork whether the bridge will hold or not. The development of the vaccine, we could have rushed it out a lot faster, but like, we actually wanted to know. And now, sometimes there is ambiguity, but it works. Science works for, is best at, it's in its wheelhouse, its good place when we get towards rigidity. That's, if we could know something in a rigid way, yay science, we've succeeded. Knowledge here, so I've got marks of distinction, can be inherited, it's rigid. I also like to think about it this is a different tangent, so I'm going to skip it. Virtues. The virtues for the world of facts, for the world of science, knowledge, is knowledge is of facts. It's headed towards a type of rigidity. It's definitive, it's binary, it's true or false. Yay, science. They can build bridges. They can cure diseases. This is like great. This is good. There's nothing defective. There's nothing pejorative about the world of science. Yes? I want to repeat the question for those you can't hear. Is there a part of science that's not controlled by people? Yes, yes, yes. And that's part of what allows the rigidity. So for instance, when you're doing a scientific experiment, the scientific method, your personal feelings, in theory, should not count. Unlike the world of relationships, right? In science, the beautiful thing about science is that you cannot manipulate the world to be the way that you want. I mean, that's the hope, is that you conform to the way the world is, and that takes a lot of work to figure out. Yes, so it's not determined by us in a way. Yes, sir.
Could you clarify your remarks about science is rigid? Because that is the polar opposite of my experience.
Okay.
It has changed so much over the last
Great.
years.
Yes.
And I also don't agree with your point that it's inherited.
Yeah.
Would you clarify?
Absolutely, absolutely. Can I clarify the point that science isn't rigid? It isn't, in my experience, with everything that's changed over like the last century, for instance, and about it being inherited. Okay. When we get to Einstein, right? That's what you're thinking? Yes.
I'm also thinking of Einstein, any formula he used as lambda.
Yeah.
Which is uncertainty.
Uh-huh.
So uncertainty, by definition, is not rigid.
Yes. Yes. Certainty principle. I love saying Columbus because as soon as we talk about science, we're not thinking about how to build a house. We're thinking about the theory of relativity and quantum mechanics, which is awesome. Can you give me a break? For just a minute. No, that's a great question. I want to get to it. But what I want to say is like the building blocks. The building blocks of what we start off with in science, the small stuff we start off, we're looking for a type of rigidity, a binariness, a true or falseness. And so for instance, I'm equating, and this is like, probably should have done a little bit of work here, science with like empiricism. Empiricism being like the theory of what is physically knowable. What is knowable is physically done. And so empirical facts, like for instance, the distance between me and the back wall is what I'm trying to go for, is a type of empirical method for figuring that out. And that is something that's definitive. And it allows for a type of straightforward yes or no-ness. Now, I actually think that science involves a lot of what I've been calling the relational, but like we'll get there in a minute. Basic building blocks is where we're starting, though. Great question. Yeah, how?
Couldn't you say that the basic facts underlying science don't change, but our methods for analyzing and understanding science do change?
Yeah. Yes, I love it. Yeah. Yeah, how do we construct the theory of everything? That's really difficult and really interesting. No, you're walking out on me. I understand. In protest. No, choir members, thanks so much for starting. I'm sure I cleared everything up. Yeah. Yeah.
In my worldview,
Yeah. What? Oh my gosh. Are you a plant?
I was looking for you to clarify.
Good. Okay. All right, forward. All right, so here's a basic schema for the world of relationships, the world of spirit, the spiritual world, the religious world. I want to say that the mark of distinction is requires, and here we'll qualify, interpersonal work, personal work, relationships. I'm going to Skip over the wealth part. The virtues is a type of vulnerability, understanding. This is what the Bible uses as faith, hope, and love. Examples I have are saying I love you versus living I love you. I think a lot of the problems with religion is that we treat it as just a bunch of facts, as just a bunch of words. That all that it means to believe in God is to say, I believe in God. But actually, what Jesus is up to is getting us towards an embodiment of those virtues. And the embodiment is what takes work. It's something that has to be lived out. Okay, I'm going to skip this part too. I've got an example in mind. This is one of the earliest Christian documents. St. Paul wrote this in about 40 AD. It's the first letter that was shared to the Christian community. It precedes, maybe 25, precedes the Gospels. The Gospel of Mark, which is mostly thought of as the first gospel account of Jesus, comes after this letter. A lot of the imagery that St. Paul uses is picked. See, this is like stuff I didn't know till I went to smart school, seminary. A lot of the imagery that Mark uses is stolen from Paul, not the reverse. I mean, who cares about that? But it's kind of interesting to me. All right, listen up. Now, concerning the times and seasons, brothers and sisters, you do not have anything written to you. You do not need to have anything written to you. For you yourselves know very well that the day of the Lord will come like a thief in the night. When they say peace and security, then sudden destruction will come upon them, as labor pains come upon a pregnant woman, and there will be no escape. But you, beloved, are not in darkness, for that day to surprise you like a thief. For you are all children of light and children of the day. We are not of the night nor in darkness. So then, let us not fall asleep as others do, but let us keep awake and be sober. For those who sleep, sleep at night, and those who get drunk at night. But since we belong to the day, let us be sober. The thing about this that plays very prominently in the gospel accounts is the stay awake part. That's a central image that gets used a ton throughout the early Christian literature. What I like about this quote is that when you press upon it, it gets squishy, and it has the feeling of changing in my mind. The first critical question is, why is St. Paul so judgmental towards people preaching peace and security? Anybody was here for the 9 o'clock sermon? The peace of Jesus is good and something that the church was centrally founded on. Jesus shows up, and the first thing he says to his disciples is, peace be with you. But Paul says, when they say, that is, the children of darkness, when they say peace and security, sudden destruction will come upon them. Anybody want to venture a guess as to what might be the fly in Paul's ointment here? Why think about peace and security as a negativism? Was that Janet? Might lead to war? In my mind, great question. In my mind, it's something more immediate than a peace resolution at the UN leading to bad consequences. Yeah. Yes. Uh-huh. Uh-huh. Okay, so let me just summarize for the people who are listening online. Hey, everybody. Paul, writing from the Jewish community, is talking, there are other faith groups, some in the Gentile community, and he's trying to distinguish his view versus their view. Absolutely, that's exactly what's happening. But why distinguish it through, some people are preaching peace. Okay, good. So, okay, thank you, that's perfect. So, in actuality, it's likely that there are people preaching Jesus that Paul is talking to, and they're preaching Jesus as preaching peace and security, and that really bugs Paul. Yeah, which is like a historical, how would you know? Any thoughts about why? Yeah, Chris. Maybe the mic, I can't hear you. And if I move, the mics will squawk. Oh.
The passages where you're putting up treasures for yourself on earth and the security of that, and you're focused on that,
yes.
Not the ethereal.
Awesome. Thank you, Chris. Perfect. Yes. So it's kind of storing the riches of earth. Done this presentation a lot, and usually have like twice as much time, so if it goes bad, that's why. Yeah. Right. Okay. Yes. Exactly. Yes. The word that Jesus uses is peace. You don't hear Jesus talking about security very often, for obvious reasons. But the time when this really bombs consistently is when I talk to people under the age of 20. And it took me a long time to figure out why. And I think a big part of it is the peace and security bit, just as Chris mentioned. There's a part of faith that makes a lot of sense, or more sense, I think, in a way, once you come to a sense of your own death, which children don't have, thank God. It's biologically difficult for them to conceptualize in a meaningful way their death, which is why I think, it was a miracle that I survived. The things that I did in high school are crazy. I mean, from a survival standpoint, okay. The Lord coming like a thief in the night. Lots of times when we think about religion as being awful at giving good, basic, phenomenological explanations of human behavior. Phenomenological. We think of religion as not being very insightful about basic things that people experience. I think St. Paul is doing great, deep work on the human psyche here. And that is a fundamental fact of our life is that death can come at any moment, like the thief in the night. And that is fundamentally true. No matter the industry selling home security units, there is nothing that any of us can do at a fundamental level to make sure that we don't die today. Stroke, heart attack, asteroid out of the sky, all of it and that's just like life and death. All of it, all of life can change in a moment. And it doesn't very often. That's why we can build buildings and stuff, and that's great. But none of us are protected from the very fundamental things that we believe about ourselves, the fundamental connections in our life. All of that can change in a moment. You guys with me on that one too? Therefore, if people are telling you, and this is what I think St. Paul is getting at, if people are telling you that if you believe in Jesus, you will get security, those people are fundamentally lying to you, both about the nature of reality, it's not like that, and also the type of claims that Jesus was interested in, which is not about your security, but about like giving yourself up to death for Jesus. What is faith like? Faith is like sobriety. Not in literal, like, don't ever drink sobriety, but a willingness to be present in the world in a way that is like nuanced and careful and awake and alert and a readiness to respond as things change, to pivot, as we've been saying through the pandemic. That is the nature of faith. So again, in contrast, often we think about faith as like the thing that happened 2,000 years ago and everything's static and known, and it's just a bunch of resuscitations and trying to figure out what the beliefs are. But for St. Paul, as for Jesus, faith is fundamentally a dynamic thing. Hence me thinking that it's much more helpful to talk about faith as a relationship, which is also dynamic. If I lock in who I believe Jude is, well, this used to work 6 years ago when Jude was 6. If Ruby at 8, if I lock that in, someone who loves to dance, for instance, ballet, if I start planning and plotting her career to the National Ballet Center of DC or whatever, that's a type of staticness that can lead to serious disruption when Ruby decides that she wants to be, I don't know, a fencing star or whatever. Relationships are dynamic. That's the work part. We have to stay present if we want to continue to know someone throughout the stages of their life. And when relationships break down, oftentimes it's because our perception has radically changed from what is actually the case, and the perception can't work together. Similarly with religion. Yep. Oh, okay, good. I think this is a slide. So I grew up thinking, so I'm trying to give you like an idea of what I take to be good religion. And in fairness to the church that I grew up in, I was like a child when I grew up, as we all were, and like my perceptions of my church were my childhood perceptions. And I think that there's a lot more nuance in the faith community that I grew up in that I understood at the time. But I grew up thinking about faith as like, again, like a thing of facts. Christians don't have long hair. This is like really important to some of the people I grew up with. They certainly don't drink. They talk about Jesus in a certain way. They're always at church. And by those indicators, you were Christian. It was like this outer garment, a fact thing, a thing that you could just take, like by not drinking. I actually think it's the reverse. This, I think, is what Jesus is constantly going around. If you look at where the fights are between Jesus and other people, it is never with the poor. At least in the Gospel of Mark is the one I know best. Jesus never criticizes the masses, even when they ask for his execution. His wrath is always turns towards the institution. So one example of that is the Pharisees, Jesus believes, thinks if you say the right prayers, if you wear the right robes, then you have clearly indicated that you are on God's side. And Jesus says, I don't care about the prayers, I don't care about your robes, I care about justice for the widow. It's Matthew 24. It's the larger life. It's, have I ingested the love and mercy and forgiveness of God? Jesus looks at the holistic picture, not something that is an outward sign. Jesus requires work. God's love is freely given. The work that Jesus did on the cross and the resurrection, I believe, was a saving act for all of creation, not just individuals or people. So when, like, a kind of snide thing, but I think it's kind of funny too, is when, like, an evangelical will say, like, are you saved? And I say, yes, 2,000 years ago when Jesus died and rose again on the cross, right? That's the saving act. Didn't require work. What does require work is us bringing that into liveliness in our bodies. It takes work to believe it, to live it, to change our lives in response to it. What do you think? Clear, not clear? Where are the pressure points? I'm not suggesting there shouldn't be pressure points. I'm just wondering, which ones are there? See you next time, folks. Yeah. Yeah. Okay, what? Yes. Why are there other trappings in religion? Right? Yeah, because it's just about like the inward personal work. Okay, so awesome, so awesome. This is the turn. This is the turn. It's a hard one because I've presented science and religion as being fundamentally different, not in conflict with one another, each other, but being fundamentally different. And here's where they start to like interlace again in helpful but complex and difficult ways. Okay. Anytime we get to, this is what I hope. Anytime we get to a pressure point in thinking about religion, somebody have something that they're always like really concerned about with religious belief, Christianity in general, off the top of their head? What was that? Abortion. Oh, mama. Thank you. Good. I was thinking like the incarnation. Good. Abortion, that's a real and present thing. One of our parishioners, who's a priest, Mally Lloyd, who preceded me in my job, her spouse, Catherine, was the CEO of the National Abortion Federation, and an Episcopal priest. I hope to have her come and do a forum, especially after the court gets done mucking up Roe v. Wade. So come back. Okay, what I was thinking of, Joe Kohler once asked me, like, why in the Nicene Creed does it say that Jesus rose again? When did he rise the first time? You know, I was like, oh, that's great. Anytime that we have a, like, what's going on here, like, theologically, like, what are we asked to believe? Here's my suggestion. If the fundamental thing about faith is relationships, try to pose it in that sphere, in that ball field, in that sport. So, why prayer? Why prayer? The prayer book, in my mind, you're asking like why corporate stuff, why I like all the trappings. That's how I took your question. In relationships work best with some best practices. Best practices for relationships, I have in mind here marriage, but also like parent-child relationships. There's also best practices for clergy and parishioner. It's something that we can actually study, right? And I'm not an expert in like what makes a marriage work well, but as I understand it, like couples that go routinely on date nights, like have a statistical better chance of a long marriage than couples who don't. Also, couples who undertake a renovation of their home when they're already experiencing financial difficulty have a statistically very high chance of divorce. It's just like a fact. It makes a lot of sense. You know, we all get caught up in the world in particular ways, but like there are best practices for relationships. That's something that we can study. Now, of course, me knowing that and me incorporating that into my life are two very different things. That's what church is, okay? The prayer book, so in my personal relationship with Jenna, our relationship works best, I know I'm talking on YouTube, our relationship works best when one of us usually has a clear defined, some clear defined chores. The stress in our house goes down dramatically when the dishes are done every night. And we have, and Rosemary gets put into the bath immediately after supper, and then gets dressed into jammies, has books, and by like 7 is a good night, 8 is a late night, is tucked away in bed, yelling and screaming, but like the door's shut. And we have one of those things where she can't open the door to keep her in there. Okay, I'm just telling you, like, the stress in our house goes down dramatically. Those are rules. Those are rules, that's discipline. The prayer book, in my mind, is our commitment to washing dishes at night. They're the best practices that we as a collective have come together. This is how we pray together. Here are the words that we use. If you want to go deeper in your relationship to God, here is a roadmap of prayer in community. So in my mind, that takes the best of the empirical, the stuff that we can observe, like how does prayer actually happen in communities, and marries it to individual and collective responsibility. Both are deeply important. Science and religion, and they relate to each other, and they talk to each other, and they make each other better. And this is, I'm really selling everybody short here. The best science, I was listening to, on PBS, they had the guy who got the Nobel Prize for a cancer therapy. He figured out the T receptor. Does anyone know anything about cancer? I think it's a T receptor. Like, he figured out where it was and how to latch it on and how to get it to latch on to cancerous cells. Listening to him talk about that process, it was all about wisdom. It was him not being rigid, right? It was him being able to say, I've had this experience, what if I did something creative and tried something new? And in my mind, that is into the world of relationship. But notice again, what he's hunting for is this kind of binary, will it work, will it won't work? So to me, the connections go very deep indeed. Okay, let me just stop there for a second. Driving down the road, you might come across a monastery. If I was 18 years old and I saw a monastery, I would say, those people don't know anything about God. It's how I thought at 18. It's just a bunch of rigid, rule-following people who don't have the Holy Spirit. Now, what I think, when I pass by any church, come back later for my conversation on interfaith dialogue, any place of worship, I think, what's going on there? Are these people really embodying the justice and the love of God, or is it all for show? I think there's a lot of both. There's a lot of it at St. Columbus, of both. That's what makes faith. One thing I forgot is that, again, trying to think about faith as relationship, and relationship as something that's dynamic and not static. The word for Israel comes from when Jacob is wrestling an angel, or maybe even the presence of God, where it's like kind of unclear what's happening there. And they wrestle all night, neither win. And the angel or the presence of God renames Jacob Israel. Israel literally translates to a people who struggle with God. That is the nature of faith. Far from it being a book of rigid answers, where you've got a question, we've got an answer, it's all set in stone. Faith is about the dynamic, ever-changing, imaginative, creative process of relationships. That's why we talk about love so much. On a level of clarity, not agreement, but on a level of clarity, did that come through so? Anybody have a closing thought? Not that you need to. I know I just kind of dumped a whole bunch. Sarah, please, Mike's right behind you, if you don't mind.
So, in my experience, a lot of the issues that people have with science and religion stem from sort of like the question of how do we know what is true?
How do we know what is true?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And like on certain issues like evolution or like resurrection,
Yeah.
things that we would get different answers
Yep.
from those two different like schools of thought.
Yes.
How can you address that a little bit based on like what you've been talking about with like
Big time.
things being relational, things being empirical?
Yes. Thank you. Really appreciate that question. So to kind of approach it from the other direction, you can imagine how opposed I would be to a conversation about God, as in, here are 5 proofs for God's existence. Looking back at that language now, can you all feel the tension that I have? Because that, in my mind, is unhelpfully trying to combine the world of empiricism with the world of faith. As though if we had a giant enough microscope, we could like see the God particle. Or if the disciples were trying to figure out, if we were the disciples and we're trying to figure out the incarnation, and we started to like strip away the flesh of Jesus to like find where is God in there. Where is God in the incarnation is in the spirit between Jesus and God, Jesus and the disciples, Jesus and himself interpersonally. That's where the incarnation is found. It is not a matter of scientific experiment, which is not to say that science isn't important. Do you see how I get to have my cake and eat it too? Scientific experiment, super great. Not going to help you with incarnation in the traditional sense of the word. Yes, so the major cultural flashpoints are about like the hey Matthew, about the creation story. Now here is where I think there's actually some interlacing of faith and science. Well, hey Matthew, glad you're here, man. We're almost done. Just give me one more minute and we'll talk, okay? In that there's a historical study of the Bible, figuring out how much of it has a historical basis, how much of it can be known because of the kind of cultural idioms that can be traced. And all that stuff is really interesting. So there's lots of like fascinating insights that we can come about the serious, rigorous study of New Testament history, Old Testament history, of ancient faith practices that can be deeply informative and even challenging. So I think of those things as being really helpful too, although I know that was like, thank you, Sarah. Well, I'm sorry, time's up. Thanks so much for your generosity and great questions listening. I hope to do it again.